Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Inside 340B Report. I'm Shannon Young, an associate editor and senior writer at 340B Report. And today I'm joined by Will Newton, who is also a 340B Report associate editor and senior writer. Ted Slavsky, our publisher and CEO, is off today. Before we dive into the latest 340B developments, I want to let our listeners know that we are pleased to offer a special 25% discount to 340B Report for first-time subscribers. You can go to the subscribe tab at 340breport.com and use the coupon code podcast25 to take advantage of the discount. I know you will find our services to be a valuable investment, especially if you're listening to this podcast. Also, I want to encourage you to check out 340B Report's new business-focused podcast, 340B Leaders Up Front, which is hosted by Anna Mangum. The podcast showcases conversations with industry executives who are at the cutting edge of innovation and leadership in the 340B space. Today, we're going to focus on the latest developments in the 340B rebate saga, including the Trump administration's approval of Novartis' rebate model pilot plan, new details HRSA has released on its rebate pilot model that's set to go live on January 1st, and recent oral arguments in a high-profile federal court case that centers around 340B rebates. We'll also discuss Kalderos' entrance into the 340B contract pharmacy space, with the first drug maker recently announcing it will shift from Second Site Solutions' 340B ESP clearinghouse to Kalderos' Truzo next month. So let's start with the latest on 340B rebates. Will, I know you've been doing a lot of reporting on this, and in our last episode, we discussed the 8 drug maker plans that HRSA initially approved for 9 of the 10 drugs eligible for the 340B rebate pilot. So there's been a lot of developments since then, including HRSA's approval of the final eligible drug makers rebate model. What can you tell us about all of that?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, there are 10 drugs eligible for HRSA's 340B rebate pilot. Those are the 10 drugs chosen for the first round of Medicare drug price negotiations. And when HRSA announced its initial approvals on October 30th, there was one drug that was very noticeably missing, and that was Novartis's Entresto, which is a medication that mainly treats chronic heart failure. After HRSA announced those initial approvals and Novartis wasn't there, we reached out to the company, and a spokesperson told us the next day that Novartis is basically refining its implementation plan to incorporate, quote, technical updates HRSA requested. And then fast forward 2 weeks, HRSA updated its rebate pilot approval page to note that a rebate pilot plan was approved for Novartis's Entresto. The only difference between that approval and the other ones is that Novartis's rebate pilot plan is taking effect on April 1st, whereas all of the other ones are going live, as you said, on January 1st. So that's definitely a development that we will be following closely.
That's really interesting. And it's not the only major development that you've recently covered on the rebate-related issues. New details have emerged about HRSA's rebate pilot, some of which have raised concerns among 340B providers and the advocacy community. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Keep in mind, this rebate pilot is this super high stakes thing, as our readers know and our listeners know, and it's happening in a very compressed timeline. It's only going to be 2 months between the time that it goes live for most of them, January 1st, and the time HRSA announced the initial approvals. And so as we're learning more about how the implementation of this model will play in practice, we have been hearing quite a few concerns and questions. And one of the biggest ones we've heard from providers has to do with the definitions that the drug makers assign to some of the claims data fields. HRSA, when it initially announced the approvals on October 30th, its announcement listed several pharmacy claims data fields and several medical claims data fields that manufacturers could require covered entities to report as part of the rebate pilot, but HRSA didn't really go into a ton of detail for all of them. It just listed them. So for instance, it listed 340B ID as medical claims and pharmacy claims data field, but it just said 340B ID. There wasn't any more information. And after HRSA announced that, manufacturers began providing more detailed definitions of what each of those claims would be. And so Beacon Channel Management, which is the drug industry platform that all of the manufacturers selected for the rebate pilot, selected to administer their pilot programs, it updated its FAQs, a lot of manufacturer implementation plans posted on Beacon, also defined all of these fields. And there are some provider concerns in particular on how Beacon and the manufacturers defined 340B ID in the pharmacy claims data field. So Beacon defined it as, quote, the HRSA assigned parent 340B ID of the covered entity where the prescription originated. This led to some provider concerns that Beacon's definition could disqualify referral prescriptions written by outside specialists that had historically and traditionally been eligible under HRSA's 340B patient definition. Talked to a number of provider consultants and advocates and attorneys who expressed a lot of concerns there. There were others that were a little less concerned, but the consensus generally was that there was some confusion about what this would mean in practice. And so we reached out to HRSA, and then we wrote an article about this. And a little bit after we wrote the article in 340B report, HRSA got back to us, and I'll read their full statement, which is only 2 sentences, but I think pretty important because it was a fairly substantive response that HRSA gave us. And the spokesperson said, quote, HRSA does not intend for the implementation of the 340B rebate pilot to impose new restrictions on which prescriptions are eligible to be filled with 340B drugs. We will be working with Beacon and manufacturers to ensure that their references to the 340B ID to be included on rebate claims are as clear as intended. And so I think that was pretty notable that in light of all of these concerns, HRSA did try to, in a very substantive way, clarify and ease some of those concerns. And there still are many others that haven't been addressed, but that was for sure a notable development.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm sure we're going to get even more details and clarifications on things involving this rebate pilot, especially now that the federal shutdown has ended and HRSA is back to work and everybody is all hands on deck here. And so this is something we're obviously going to keep our eyes on over the next several weeks here. So thanks for all of your reporting on that, Will.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your help as well.
Yeah, definitely. So wanted to zoom out a little bit here because this rebate pilot is happening in a larger conversation, a larger debate around 340B rebates. And as our listeners know, this started last summer in 2024 when different drug makers started coming forward with their own rebate proposals. And that sparked a lot of court action here. And so we had a major development this past week where a Washington, D.C. federal court heard oral arguments related to that litigation. And this could have a lot of implications for the future of 340B rebates with the pilot, but also beyond that. So, Will, what can you tell us about what happened at this hearing? I know you were there in person, but can you just give us a little bit of background here and also just tell us what you heard and saw?
Definitely. On top of all of the 340B rebate pilot implementation that we've been tracking, there has been this huge court case that you mentioned happening as well. And this court case it's not directly about HRSA's rebate pilot per se. It's about a more fundamental question, which is who, if anyone, under the 340B statute has the authority to decide whether or not there can be rebates in the 340B program. And as you said, the outcome of that case will in turn have some pretty significant implications on HRSA's 340B rebate pilot. This is a federal appeals court in Washington, D.C. It's an appeal of 2 lower court rulings, also in Washington, D.C., that found that the federal government has the authority to decide whether or not drug makers can or cannot implement 340B rebates. And at this case, which, as you said, I attended in person, there were 3 parties, and all 3 parties were arguing for their pretty different interpretation of what the 340B statute says. First of all, we had HHS, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the attorney representing HHS argued that the 340B statute says that the HHS secretary has the authority to decide whether or not drug makers can offer 340B pricing in the form of a rebate. And it was this authority that HRSA used in order to implement and justify its 340B rebate pilot. So that was one of the sides. Then we had the drug industry, and attorneys for the drug makers involved in the case were arguing that under the 340B statute, they can implement 340B rebates regardless of what HHS says. They are saying that 340B rebates and rebates in general are standard business practice in the pharmaceutical pricing space. And they're arguing that it's unlawful for HHS to say that they cannot use what they describe as standard business practices in order to offer 340B pricing to covered entities. And then kind of as a secondary argument, they were saying, okay, if you do say HHS has authority to decide this, then the only way they can do that is through their pharmaceutical pricing agreements. But the gist of the drug maker's argument was that they should be able to implement 340B rebate models, regardless of the government. And then finally, the third party involved in the case was 340B Health, which is intervening in the case. And interveners are basically third parties in a case that have a direct stake in their outcome. They can request for an involvement. 340B Health is basically arguing that, okay, the outcome of this case will have huge implications on 340B hospitals. So we want a seat at the table to be able to argue our side, which is not necessarily the same side as the government. So they had an attorney there as well. And that attorney was arguing that under the 340B statute, there can't be any rebates, full stop. Basically, the argument was that the statute says that manufacturers must offer covered entities no higher than the 340B ceiling price. And so the attorney was arguing that means that any rebate at all would be impermissible under the statute. So we had all of those arguments, and I got a little bit into the weeds there, but the outcome is going to be super, super important for the future of the program. If this court sides with the government, just like the other two courts did, that means that HRSA will have pretty strong legal footing for its pilot program, which providers have strongly opposed. Also means HRSA, if the agency does elect to expand it in the future, would have some pretty good legal footing for that as well, although we could and probably will see more lawsuits. If the court, on the other hand, sides with drug makers, that likely would open the door for there to be much more expansive rebate models. Prior to HRSA's pilot, the rebate models that drug makers like Johnson & Johnson and Sanofi proposed were much more expansive, required a lot more claims data, etc., than the ones that HRSA approved under its pilot. So if the court goes that direction, I think we could expect to see more drug makers introduce rebates like that. And finally, obviously, if the court sides with 340B Health and the interveners, that could put a halt to HRSA's rebate pilot. So we will really, really be closely watching that to see what happens.
Well, thanks for that recap. I know it's hard to read into judges' questioning, but can you give us a little bit of flavor here for some of the conversation that was had in the courtroom during oral arguments from this three-judge panel here?
Yeah, one thing that stood out to me a lot is that the judges were very well versed in the 340B program and the 340B statute, which is not always the case. And it's definitely difficult. It wasn't entirely clear which direction they were going. I will say there were tough questions all around, but there were a lot of notable exchanges between the judges and the attorneys representing the drug industry. There are some questions about, basically judges were saying, okay, if you're already allowed to collect claims data as part of your contract pharmacy restrictions through 340B ESP, why do you need this additional data here? There was also some acknowledgement of the fact that providers and some bipartisan lawmakers have been very strongly opposed to this model, and that it would be a very big shift in how the 340B program is operated. So I think there is some sense from the judges as well in sort of their seeming agreement or with the government's position that some thought needed to be put into this change. There's also some interesting discussions about how this compares, the 340B rebate model compares to the replenishment model that a lot of providers have been using, and HRSA has given the green light for a while now. And basically, the drug industry was arguing that the replenishment model that covered entities, many of them use to restock inventory once they dispense a 340B drug, that was no different than the rebate model. The government and 340B Health strongly disagreed with that and were arguing that that model doesn't involve covered entities having to purchase drugs above the 340B price. So that was a pretty interesting exchange as well. But to answer your question in sort of a cop-out way, there were tough questions all around. So we'll really have to wait and see before we know exactly where the judges are leaning.
Yeah, thanks for all of that, Will. And before we continue, let's take a moment to hear from one of our great sponsors.
Eliminate double payments, ensure compliance, and achieve unparalleled transparency with RX Paradigm's 340B clearinghouse. Powered by the Tungsten Plus platform, RX Paradigm aligns seamlessly with stakeholders' needs, enabling covered entities to deliver cost-effective care while preventing double payments from drug manufacturers. With RX Paradigm's collaborative 340B clearinghouse approach, double payment concerns no longer justify network restrictions. Unlock a streamlined, balanced 340B management solution for all parties, and discover efficient, optimized 340B management today with Tungsten Plus.
Shifting gears, the drug industry vendor Kalderos recently made some pretty big news with at least one drug maker announcing that it will transition from 340B ESP to Kalderos's Truzo beginning on December 1st. Shannon, you've been covering this development. What can you tell us?
Yeah, so on November 14th, Alkermes, an Ireland-based drug maker, notified 340B covered entities that beginning December 1st, its 340B contract pharmacy policy will require new claims data submissions. And it also announced that covered entities will also have to submit that information via Truzo, which is Kalderos' platform, and not 340B ESP, which is a platform they've been using under Alkermes' policy since 2024. And so this is noteworthy for a few reasons. First, Alkermes is the first drug maker to shift from 340B ESP to Kalderos' Truzo platform. And that platform includes 340B rebate capabilities. 340B ESP is operated by Second Sight Solutions, which is Will mentioned earlier, is the company behind Beacon Channel Management. And that's going to administer all of the approved drug makers' 340B rebate pilot models. So as you may remember, Kalderos first launched Truzo in September 2024, but use of the platform has really stalled since then. We haven't seen any drug makers make announcements that they were going to use it. But what we did see was Eli Lilly, the drug maker, included Truzo in its 340B rebate model proposal, or its plan to convert 340B from an upfront discount to a back-end rebate. But that's been held up in litigation, and Lilly was not eligible for HRSA's rebate pilot program since it wasn't included on the list of the drugs eligible for the first round of Medicare drug price negotiations. And so Alkermes really came out of nowhere with this announcement that it was going to switch over to Truzo. A company spokesman told 340B Report that additional drug makers are likely to follow suit, and they are, quote, several manufacturers are transitioning to our Truzo platform. As of the recording of this podcast episode, Alkermes is the only drug maker that's publicly made that transition. And its announcement drew some pushback from 340B provider advocates who took issue with its short transition timeline. So again, it announced it on November 14th. This change is supposed to take effect on December 1st. So these advocates have argued that it gives covered entities just about 2 weeks during the holiday season, the Thanksgiving holiday, to register with Truzo and designate a contract pharmacy. Some have argued that that timeline is, quote, unreasonable. And critics have also cautioned that it could decrease access to treatments for important drugs that are used to treat substance use disorder and behavioral health conditions. And so we are going to keep our eye on this development and see what other drug makers, if any, start making this transition. Again, most have used 340B ESP, and that has kind of been the only game in town until now. So it's very interesting. Alkermes also announced that it will end its 340B contract pharmacy exemption for Oklahoma 340B covered entities. So as you may remember from our last podcast, a few drug makers announced exemptions to Oklahoma to comply with that state's contract pharmacy access law. But right before that law was supposed to take effect, a court held up its enforcement. And so we've seen Alkermes announce that it is no longer going to enforce those exemptions as of December 1st. And then just an update on the Oklahoma front briefly. Oklahoma's Attorney General had planned to appeal that ruling, and his office has formally appealed to the U.S. 10th Circuit Court of Appeals on that on November 12th.
Yeah, this is super interesting to follow, and it is really fascinating that Truzo is coming into play because, as you mentioned, Kalderos and Beacon were both kind of competing, both had rebate platforms, and we're hoping drug makers would sign up for those. And then every single one approved for HRSA's pilot ended up going with Beacon and not Truzo. And then on top of that, Beacon's parent company, Second Sight Solutions, also runs 340B SP. And so Second Sight Solutions is just getting so much data and seemingly had a near monopoly on this space from the manufacturer side. But super interesting that Truzo is now in play. And I'm really curious to see what happens there. And finally, if you are a subscriber, I would strongly encourage you to register for 340B Report's upcoming webinar on HRSA's 340B rebate pilot, which will take place on December 15th. At this webinar, we're going to be joined by Catherine Richardson, who's very involved with Beacon's platform. Shannon and I will be presenting in the webinar as well. And the goal will be to really answer all of your last minute questions about HRSA's rebate pilot. And as we discussed earlier in the podcast, there are quite a few of them. So this webinar is available for all of our subscribers. And if you aren't a subscriber and would like to join, I encourage you to subscribe now. And with that brings us to the end of today's episode. We're going to continue to keep an eye on all things 340B related and be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Of course, we will report on anything that happens in the meantime on our website, and encourage everyone listening to follow along with our twice weekly newsletters. And just as one last reminder, if you are not a current subscriber, you can take advantage of our 25% discount for first-time subscribers only by going to 340breport.com, clicking the subscribe button, and using the discount code podcast25. Thank you.